15-minute or less lecture series, Human Anatomy, Chapter 23, the Respiratory System, Part 2. So, from the trachea, we go now to the bronchi. The bronchi are a series of branching tubes that conduct air from the trachea to deep structures within the lungs, specifically the respiratory zone structures deep in the lungs. And there's also some filtering of air because the structures are lined with the mucous membrane that produces mucus and has cilia that can move the mucus out. So, the way it goes is you go from the trachea down to the left and right main bronchus. So one bronchus, left main bronchus. Then the main bronchi will split into the lobar bronchi, one lobar bronchi per lobe for that lung. And then from there, the lobar bronchi will split into the segmental bronchi, which will go to different special segments of the lung. And then from there, they'll continue to branch into smaller structures until they become the bronchioles, which become the microscopic terminal bronchioles, which is the end of the conduction portion of the bronchial tree. The bronchi possess the same 4 layers, similar to what you found in the trachea. However, as the bronchi get smaller and smaller, there are some structural changes that occur. So, for instance, on the mucosa layer, the innermost layer, it initially starts off in the main bronchi with ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, but as you go deeper and deeper in, it becomes ciliated simple columnar and then finally ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue in the bronchioles, until finally, when you reach the terminal bronchioles, there is no more cilia, it's just simple cuboidal epithelium. At the fibromusculocartilaginous layer, the main bronchi still have C-shaped cartilage rings. The lobar bronchi, the rings become more plates, so they're thinner and smaller. Then they continue into the segmental bronchi and so on, becoming smaller and smaller, so there's less and less cartilage within these structures, until finally you reach the terminal bronchioles that have no cartilage, just smooth muscle tissue in this layer. Overall, as you get less and less cartilage, the smooth muscle tissue increases in relative amounts to compensate. So again, the less cartilage is present, the more smooth muscle tissue must be there to take its place. As a consequence, people can have what are called asthma attacks. Asthma attacks are when the bronchioles, smooth muscles, spasm, leading to partial or complete closure of the bronchioles. And because there's no supporting cartilage to force the structures to stay open, the smooth muscles can constrict completely, stopping airflow. Also, during asthma attacks, there can be inflammation within the mucous membrane, which can cause swelling, which would then decrease the overall lumen or space within the bronchiole, and also excessive mucus production, which also would then take up space where air could be. So again, the overall effect of an asthma attack is a reduction in the amount of space that air can travel through these bronchioles, and in some cases can even be completely blocked. All right, the lungs. Each lung, right and left lung, are surrounded by a pleura membrane. This is a serous membrane that has the visceral layer lying on the lung organ itself, a parietal layer that lies against the thoracic cage and other structures surrounding the lungs, and then a thin space in between that called the pleural cavity, which is filled with serous fluid. This fluid reduces friction and provides lubrication for the lungs, so that as the lungs expand and contract and rub against the various structures, there's less friction and therefore less damage to the lungs themselves. All right, the right lung has 3 lobes. It has a superior lobe, a middle lobe, and an inferior lobe. There's a horizontal fissure between the superior lobe and middle lobe, and an oblique fissure between the middle lobe and the inferior lobe. The left lung only has 2 lobes, a superior lobe and an inferior lobe, with an oblique fissure between those 2 lobes. The left lung also has a small depression on it called the cardiac notch. This depression is to make room for the heart because the left side of the heart is a bit larger than the right side. Finally, the lungs are attached to the diaphragm, which is a very important respiratory muscle. The very point at the top of the lungs are referred to as the apex. The broad area at the bottom of the lungs are the base. The area where structures such as the bronchi, blood vessels, lymph vessels, nerves, etc. enter and exit the lung, that area is referred to as the hilum. It turns out the right lung is a little broader and shorter than the left lung. And this is because the liver, being such a large organ, actually pushes up a little bit into the thoracic cavity, basically pushing on the diaphragm. Uh, as the segmental bronchi are formed, they each go to a specific bronchiopulmonary segment of the lung. So each segmental bronchus goes to a very specific portion of each lung. You don't need to learn all the names of those different areas, just that they exist. All right, so that is all for the conduction zone and the lungs. Then we reach the respiratory zone deep in the lungs. Respiratory zone starts with the respiratory bronchioles. So we go main bronchi, lobar bronchi, segmental bronchi, bronchioles to the terminal bronchioles, which then lead to the respiratory bronchioles, where we get the first instances of gas exchange with the bloodstream. The respiratory bronchioles then split into what are called alveolar ducts. Each alveolar duct leads to an alveolar sac, which is this grape cluster-shaped structure. Each of the little grapes within the cluster is one alveolus, so many alveoli make up the alveolar sac. The alveoli and all the various other structures within the respiratory zone are covered with pulmonary capillaries, with blood capillaries that lie next to the thin walls of the alveoli and alveoli-like structures in the respiratory bronchioles. So as you can see here, super thin walls for the alveoli. Here's a blood vessel, here is a terminal bronchiole. So each alveolus is sort of a cup-shaped structure. That's a sort of pouch. It is formed from simple squamous epithelial cells, so super thin, super flat. The type 1 alveolar cells are the simple squamous epithelial cells, and through them is where gas exchange is going to occur. The type 2 alveolar cells that are also present, seen up here, are cells that secrete a fluid called a surfactant that lines the inside of the alveolus, and the surfactant helps to reduce the tension in the fluids in the alveolus, and so helps prevent them from collapsing. And then also found within the alveolus is the alveolar macrophage, which is a immune cell going around engulfing dust particles, any things that end up in the alveolus, as well as pathogens that may be trying to cause an illness within the alveolus. The respiratory membrane is a site of gas exchange, where oxygen enters the bloodstream from the air of the alveolus, and carbon dioxide leaves the bloodstream to enter the air of the alveolus. So the respiratory membrane is made up of the alveolar wall and the blood capillary wall. So you have two simple squamous cells lying next to each other, one of them the type 1 alveolar cell, the other one the endothelial cell of the capillaries wall. And then, of course, their basement membrane lying between them. So it is this structure that makes up the respiratory membrane, and it's only 2 squamous cells wide, allowing oxygen to go in the bloodstream and carbon dioxide to leave the bloodstream. Smoking is bad. Don't smoke. It can cause people to become easily winded because nicotine constricts the terminal bronchioles, decreasing airflow. Carbon monoxide replaces oxygen on hemoglobin and red blood cells. Irritants lead to more mucus production, which fills up the lumen. The irritants can also damage cilia and destroy cilia, making it more difficult to move the irritants and mucus out, leading to coughing, and also can break down the elastic fibers of the lungs, which can cause bronchioles to collapse, leading to less efficient gas exchange. So all smoke is bad smoke, although some may be worse than others. Emphysema is when the alveolar walls actually break down. So here's a healthy view of the alveolar walls in lung tissue. Here is lung from someone with emphysema, and they end up with a dramatic decrease in gas exchange because there's less places where gas exchange can occur. Cancer. Lung cancer is the leading cause of death by cancer in the U.S. Most people who are diagnosed with lung cancer die within the first year. Bronchiogenic carcinoma is lung cancer that starts from the epithelium of the bronchial tubes, which makes sense because they're going to be exposed to a lot of the irritants and carcinogens that someone may inhale. All right, respiration. Respiration is broken down into different compartments or events. You have pulmonary ventilation. That is the movement of air from the atmosphere into or out of the lungs. So pulmonary ventilation, moving air into the lungs from the atmosphere and from the lungs out into the atmosphere. External respiration is actually the gas exchange, the exchangement of gases between the airspace inside the lungs and the pulmonary capillaries. So the gas exchange across the respiratory membrane is external respiration. Internal respiration is the gas exchange between the capillaries throughout the body and the interstitial fluids surrounding the cells of the body. So the gas exchange, the movement of carbon dioxide into the bloodstream and oxygen out in the tissues throughout the body. Inhalation, breathing in. For inhalation to occur, the pressure in the lungs must be less than the atmospheric pressure. And in order to get this to occur, we have certain muscles that will contract. The diaphragm, which pushes down, expanding the size of the lungs vertically, and the external intercostal muscles that contract to pull the ribs out and up. And so between these muscles, we expand the overall volume of the lungs, which lowers the pressure in the lungs, which allows air to move into the lungs. So again, diaphragm and external intercostals are the ones that increase the volume of the lungs, which decreases the pressure in the lungs that allows air to enter. Exhalation, for air to move out of the lungs, the pressure in the lungs must be greater than the atmospheric air pressure. This occurs when the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles relax. The lungs automatically recoil and return to their original size. This decreases the volume of the lungs, which increases the air pressure in the lungs, causing the air from in the lungs to move out into the atmosphere. If you want to have air leave the lungs quickly, you can contract the abdominal muscles and the internal intercostals, and this is referred to as forced exhalation, moving the air out really, really quickly. Within the brain, we have the respiratory center. This is within the brain stem in both the medulla oblongata and the pons. The medulla oblongata controls the overall basic rhythm of respiration, the breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, and also controlling the specific muscles needed for respiration. The pons, on the other hand, helps to coordinate the transition between inhalation and exhalation, basically to make sure we don't overinflate the lungs, because that would damage the lungs. Please subscribe and hit like below.